TCS Honcho. Time for another video. Metal on Metal, TCS Talk. We're going to be looking at Assault and Overrun as part 11 of our introduction to the TCS series. In this episode, we'll look at who can, and I will comment on who should assault or overrun. We'll go through the 7-step process of what it takes to conduct an assault or an overrun. Usually don't need all 7, but we'll go through them nevertheless. We'll talk about restrictions on assaults. We'll talk about how terrain effects are calculated. It's a little different than is normally the case for normal fires. We'll remind you players about AT rolls and how they work in assault and overrun combat. And then we'll have an example both of an assault, which is not finished, but should give you enough information to see that you understand correctly how this works. And we'll do a quick overrun example as well. Starting out, assaults and overruns are done as part of your action phase, you the phasing player, and as part of movement. They cost movement points. It's the only type of combat where you actually enter an opposing hex occupied by enemy units. It is resolved in a series of 1 to however many rounds it takes until only one side remains in a hex. So you can't end your movement phase still stacked with the enemy. Because it's part of movement and you move into the hex, assault combats begin adjacent. You have to be adjacent to the target hex in order to assault it. So, step 1 is the attacker announces an assault. Must be adjacent, and because it's part of movement, you must also be in move mode. You can't assault if you're in fire mode, even if you're adjacent. Step 2 is the target hex only has what's called a final overwatch trigger. That is, the target hex, units in the target hex, can conduct overwatch against the assaulting stack, which is 1 hex away. It's the range of 1, and that means that even if you're marked fired, you can still fire, but if you're not allowed to fire overwatch because you're suppressed or paralyzed, you may not fire final overwatch. At this point, rather than using the final overwatch trigger to fire at the enemy stack that's going to assault you, you can also declare your stack is going to save itself through an SYR retreat, a save yourself retreat instead. Only non-paralyzed, non-suppressed units can do that. Paralyzed or suppressed guys have to stay in the hex, but you can conduct that, and that's as long as the hex is now vacated, you didn't leave anything behind, the assault is now over. If that did not happen, if the attacker is still able to move, that is, it's not suppressed or paralyzed or didn't have to retreat as a result of the final overwatch trigger, it moves into the target hex. At this point, you remove any suppressed markers on defending units. Paralyzed markers stay. This represents the attacker lifting suppressive fires for the last 100 meters before they get into the target there. As a warning or tip to TCS players, this means you don't always want to be liberal with assaults, because if you move into a hex that's suppressed and assault it becomes unsuppressed, and if you lose your assault and have to retreat, then the target hex is no longer suppressed. In a sense, you unsuppress the enemy for free. So if that can cause a big mess for you as the phasing player, you might want to reconsider whether you want to assault or not. Number 4, if there is a continuous fire artillery mission that is affecting the hex, it attacks the assaulting units at this point. And because they're in the target hex, use the terrain of the assaulted hex that they're in. And of course, you're still in move mode because you're still assaulting. Step 5, do the same thing with mines. You can't use breaches in an assault. And obviously, because you're in the target hex there, that will affect morale possibly if it's partly protective or protective. Step 6 is when the assault really begins. Determine fire order of the 2 sides. Usually, it will be simultaneous. However, if one side has any unit that's suppressed or paralyzed and the other side has no such suppressed or paralyzed units, so there's a suppressed or paralyzed marker only on a unit or units of one side, then the side in good morale gets to go first. It has the first fire, and the defender checks morale, then the defender returns fire. Otherwise, and as will often be the case, the fire will be simultaneous. If you have P-fire units, such as tanks or AT guns, they need to decide to either conduct a P-fire or an area fire. That's up to them, but you can't do both. You can, of course, conduct AT rolls as well during this time, and you conduct morale and vehicle morale checks after all the fires are made. The assaulting player, if it's a tie, if it's going at the same time, the assaulting player checks first. And in the case that the assaulting player then is eliminated or has to leave the hex because of a save yourself retreat morale result, then the defending units do not need to actually make a morale roll, even if they suffered a morale check result. Step 7. Mounted units may dismount. So if you're running in there with half tracks full of infantry, they pop out of the half tracks at this point or jump off the tanks if they're Soviets. And any unit that's in move mode can change to fire mode for free if you wish. And often is the case, the assaulters will use this chance to get better cover and go into fire mode. Then, if both sides still have units in the hex, you conduct another round at number 6 and number 7. You repeat these rounds until only one side remains. Some other restrictions and rules with assaults. You have to obviously have enough movement points to enter the target hex, but there is no additional cost to assault. Weapons units, such as machine guns, AT guns, etc., must be in fire mode to fire. So you can bring them into an assault with you, but the first round they're not going to be able to fire. Mortars do not fire in assault. They're extremely vulnerable to assault, actually. You might want to garrison them, help them out, protect them. Other stuff. If you have a suppressed result during assault, now obviously you don't begin an assault with that because the defender removes all suppressed markers and the attacker can't go in with the suppressed marker. If you get a second suppressed result in assault, then the unit that's suppressed must either execute an SYR instead, or it can lose a step and from the largest unit and remain. So in a sense, morale results will have additional loss effects at times on units in assault only. Paralyzed units which are suppressed have to SYR automatically and lose half their steps rounded up. Paralyzed units that are paralyzed are eliminated via surrender. One last screen of other stuff. You may assault a hex any number of times. Negative shifts that affect both players on the fire table cancel each other out and are ignored. For instance, if it's night, or if there is smoke in the hex, that would be a -1 to both sides. Ignore any negative shifts that affect both sides equally. Notice that it says negative shifts. Positive shifts are not ignored. So the +4 for being at range 0 is not canceled out. It remains. In addition, if you've got 2 negative terrain modifiers, and the defender in the first round is going to be in fire mode, so it'll probably have better advantage than the attacker, you add 1 to each one until you get 1 to 0. So that's kind of actually, it didn't explain it too well. Let me give it a better example. Suppose you are marching into a hex in protected terrain that has a defending unit in fire mode that is dug in. What are the modifiers for that? The dug in protective modifier, it's spotted, is a -5. Moving in protective terrain, move mode is a -1. So they're both negative. What we're going to do is add 1 to each side until we get one of these guys to 0. So the -1, add 1, it gets up to 0. And the -5 is going to be a -4. So what happens? For this battle, the defender shoots at the attacker normally for terrain, and the attacker shoots at a -4 on the defender. That is until it changes mode. And we'll actually look at this in an example if that's confusing, and we'll look at that in a few minutes. So you can conduct AT rolls, point fires, area fires in any order desired, although fire is simultaneous, so it won't matter too much in assault. Important, once a unit has conducted an assault, win or lose, whether it survives and remains in the hex or retreats with a save yourself retreat, it is done for the turn. Even if it only expended 1 movement point or half a movement point, doesn't matter, its turn is over. That's not the same for Overrun, but for assault, this is the case. Okay, let's look at an example, just to show you how this kind of worked. It's an example that went through 3 rounds. It's not totally complete, but it should give you a flavor for how this works. This is the Battle of Kharskaya, which is a very normal thing at the beginning of a GD42 scenario. The Soviet has cleverly isolated a nice column or a nice alley through which to attack. Mortar smoke here to stop any Germans over here from seeing it. This unit's taken out by this smoke. The plan here is to move this stack to this space, flip it over to provide overwatch, and then charge in with this hex here, which has 4 tanks and 2 infantry platoons. So here it is, setting up the assault. They've moved here, set this up. The German machine gun decided not to fire Overwatch at this advancing stat because it was going to get hammered with return Overwatch by these 4 tanks and this infantry platoon. They've moved adjacent. At this point, this is number 1, step 1. This stack, 2 platoons plus 4 tanks, there's the 4 to show you there's 4 of them, declares an assault against that hex. They're in move mode, they're adjacent, it's all legal. Move to step 2. Final overwatch for this stack. Not this stack, it's only the stack that's being assaulted. This stack could retreat if it wanted to through a save yourself retreat instead. They would lose the AT gun, they decide they're going to stick it out. If the stack is suppressed, as it should be, then it can't do Overwatch and you'll skip this step. And in fact, let's just do that. We'll just pretend these guys here, these Germans have been suppressed somehow, in some mysterious way, and the Soviets will escape the final Overwatch and move right into the hex for step 3. So we move in here, and then the suppressed marker, which we pretended was here, is now removed, so the Germans are no longer suppressed. Here we have the 2 platoons and the 4 tanks versus an AT gun and a single German platoon. Step 4, were there an artillery attack zone, it would attack the moving Soviets right now. There ain't no such thing. We skip the step and move to step 5. Were there a minefield, and this should say step 5, not 4, whatever. If there were a minefield here, it would attack. There is no minefield. We move to step 6. Fire order is, does either side have a suppressed or paralyzed unit? No, it's simultaneous. Now we would resolve fires. And then after we resolve fires, the Soviets will check first because they're attacker. If it has to check morale, if they both have to make morale checks. So let's take a look at what happens here. The Soviets, we'll just execute the Soviet fire first. Why not? First off, it has a bunch of infantry. There is a B target, which is vulnerable to AT attacks. So the Soviets will make an AT roll versus the AT gun. It's a base 7 for being in protective terrain at range 0, -3 because it is stacked with friendly infantry, the German infantry, +1 because it's a B target, a little weak. So the Soviets needed 9 or higher on 2d6. They roll a 9. I rolled all these on Vassal, but I'm just going to give you the results here. And the AT gun is eliminated. The next step is area fire. We have 4 tanks, each with a fire factor of 3. That's 12. We have 2 infantry, each with a fire factor of 3. That's 6. And we have 10 steps of infantry. And at range 0, each step of infantry adds 1 to the firepower. So we have a total of 28, which sounds impressive. A strength of 28. But what of the modifiers? First off, +4 for range. Now, I had tried to explain earlier that there's 2 defensive modifiers. The Germans get a -5, and the Soviets get a -1. This is fire mode, protective terrain dug in, move mode, protective terrain. We're going to cancel this to get this to 0. So this is going to be, instead, it's going to be a -4 for the Soviets and a 0 for the Germans. So we have +4 for range, -4 for the terrain and dug in status. The Germans have 6 steps, so there's no stacking modifier. So because we had a strength of 28, we're in the 26 to 32 column. The die rolls at 22, not so good. And the Germans will need to check morale. Now let's look at the German situation. They've got 5 steps of infantry, 4 tanks. They make 4 AT rolls. The base is a 7, -3 because the Soviets have infantry, so they need a 10 or higher against these tanks. They roll 4 times, do not achieve a 10 plus. The Soviet tanks are safe for now. The AT gun gets to decide, does it add its strength to the area fire, which is 5, or does it fire its tanks? Because the point fires didn't go so well, it's going to shoot at the tanks. You start at the 1 unit firing, -2 for the fire differential, attack strength of 3. I don't know if you can see that here, versus defense strength of 4. If you look at the combat table for point fires, the point fire differential table, you'll see that that yields a -2 modifier. They're at point blank range, obviously, so that's a +5. And the terrain modifier we've already decided is 0 for the Soviets in this round. So you roll on 78. Germans roll hot. They get a 64, and they eliminate 1 T-34 with the AT gun. Hooray! So now the Germans take their area fire. They have a platoon that's got 5, and then it's 5 because they have 5 steps left. That's a base 10, +4 for range. Now, 0 for terrain, which we've discussed already. +3 because of stacking. The Soviets have 10 infantry steps in there, so they're going to be vulnerable. However, they also have tanks protecting them, so they have -2 for the P2 or higher strength, so that's going to be 26 to 32 column. 22, not a particularly impressive roll. Morale check. So both sides need to check morale, but nobody took any step losses due to area fires. Soviets check first because they're the assaulter. They start with a base morale of 3, if you can see that with the units. -1 because they have a P2 tank with them. -1 because they're in protective. Base 1, they roll a 36. No effect. The Germans have great morale. They start at 3, but you get -2 to be dug in and -1 for protective terrain. They roll 14. Ha ha, they are golden. Not a problem. So we have gone, oops, that's step 6. We do have step 7 now. And that is you can change to fire mode. And the Soviets all changed to fire mode because they're planning on hanging out here until they win. Nobody can dismount. Nobody went in mounted. So we're on to round 2. The Soviets have 25 firepower. They lost 3 because the tank is gone. Now, the terrain modifiers have changed because if you look at the fire table, if you're in fire mode in protective, it's a -3, and dug in fire mode is -5. So the -3 goes to 0, and the -5 drops down to -2. So basically, the Germans get a -2 firing at them, and they still shoot at zeros on the Soviets. +4 for range then, for range 0, -2 for this. And that is going to yield 25 plus 2 columns to 33 to 40. Die rolls 44. They inflict a step loss on the Germans. This is simultaneous because nobody is suppressed or paralyzed. So, German turn. They get 3 AT rolls. They've got 5 steps, but only 3 tanks remain. They need a 10 plus, 6 to 9, no effect. Their area fire is still a 10. It's going to be +4, and then -2 for the range, -2 for the tank, +3 before. This should look familiar. It's just like last turn. And they rolled poorly and got a morale check. So the Soviets got the better of that exchange. The Soviets are still at 1 morale. They roll a 52, just barely getting a no effect. And the Germans are still fine. Another hot roll for morale. So in this situation, the Germans have taken a step loss. And we're on to round 3. So Soviets fire again. They get another step loss against the Germans. The Germans fire. Strengths are reduced a little bit, but it doesn't affect things. They inflict a step loss on the Soviets. The AT rolls, one of them hits, so another Soviet tank is gone. So morale, as you can see, is creeping up a little bit because of the step losses. The Soviets are on a 2, but both sides rolled very well, so no one has broken yet. So that's just the first 3 rounds, and you saw with the pretty hot morale dice, not much happened. It would be very normal at this point for one of the sides to get suppressed, in which case it's going to have negative fire modifiers. Being suppressed often protects you from area fires, but remember that the suppress marker, the -2 for being suppressed, does not count at range 0, so that's not going to come into play in assaults. Right, let's look at overruns. Sorry, I didn't finish that example. It was just going to take too much time, but you can work it out for yourselves if you want to see how it ends up. Carrier vehicle units only may conduct overruns, so infantry units cannot. This is not SCS or OCS. The hex must cost 3 movement points or fewer to enter. The corollary of that is that you may overrun in difficult terrain, so it doesn't have to be clear. It just basically means you're running in, guns blazing, and running out. How fast you're doing this doesn't matter too much. You can use roads, although remember the defender's going to get a lot of bonuses. And in this situation, what are some differences? You don't cancel the terrain mods as we did before. So it's going to be minuses for all around. If they're all minuses, they don't kind of creep upwards. A hex can be overrun as many times as you want. Each overrun combat lasts 1 round only. You don't move in there and camp. You have 1 round of combat and you exit. Paralyzed units don't fire. You may not save yourself retreat before an overrun. Suppressed markers remain. They're not picked up at the beginning. And then after a unit overruns a hex, it exits, and the hex it exits into is an overwatch trigger. So be careful. A unit may continue overrunning all at once, and in fact, it can overrun from hex to hex to hex to hex if the units are all lined up. I've never seen it happen, but it's possible. So let's see. I don't know why I got to come back. Yeah, sorry, I just jumped a screen on you here. Here, let's take a look at an example. Here we have some suppressed German infantry and Soviet tanks eager to overrun out in the open. Is this a good idea? Maybe. Kind of depends. All right, so first off, we declare the overrun. That's step 1. There's no final overwatch because the unit was suppressed. Let's move into the hex. No artillery, no mines, none of that stuff. So the Soviets will fire first because the Germans have a suppressed unit and Soviets do not. They're going to have a strength of 12, 4 tanks, and their firepower for a T-34 is 3. And they'll be on the 26 to 32 column because they're +4 for range. But they're only going to get 1 round. Germans roll 32, they inflict a step loss. Now, because they're going first, the Germans have to check morale now. And they have a base morale of 3, +1 for the step is a 4. They roll a 61 and get another suppressed result. So because they're in, it's like assault, they have to decide, do we SYR now, or do we stay in place and take a step loss? And the Germans decide, we're going to tough it out, we'll take a step loss and stay. So the Germans are down now 2 steps already. It's the German fire. All it can do, since it's a point defense unit, is AT rolls. There are 4 targets, but now only 3 German steps. So it's the lesser of the 2. They get 3 attacks. It's a base 9, minus 2 for being suppressed, 9 for being in open terrain, range 0. If you look at the table, they need 11s, and they roll 6, 7 to 6, no effect. So Germans didn't do anything to the Soviets. The Soviets exit. That's the end of the Overrun. However, that only cost them 2 movement points. They were here, 1, 2. They got 30. If they want to keep going back and forth over this unit over and over again, that's perfectly legal. What's the motto? Be extremely careful with leaving infantry in move mode or suppressed out in the open without anybody covering them with point fires. Because if you've got lots of fast tanks roving the area, they might make your life miserable by overrunning you over and over and over again. If this German stack had been in move mode, not suppressed, but in move mode, it would not have been able to fire final Overwatch because it was not in fire mode. However, it would get its normal AT rolls, and it needs a 9. And, you know, is it worth losing a tank to inflict a step or 2 on this on average? You know, probably not. So when you're overrunning like assault, be very, very careful. So that's it. We looked at various things for assault. We looked at, you know, who could or who can or should do it. We talked about the various restrictions. We went through this 7-step, which is really more like 3-step process. And we talked about overruns and some of their differences. So that's it for this episode. We have one more installment in the TCS tutorial, number 12. We're going to clean up the rest of the rules at that point. We'll look at night. We'll look at air combat, airstrikes, and we will air sorties in the TCS, and also look at some special units.